Right, we welcome you to another episode of Learning Stories. This is a show where we profile a diverse set of learners from the 21st century. In each episode of this show, we profile a guest who has a unique story to share about how they acquired a set of diverse skills and knowledge in a creative and innovative manner. In the process, we hope to uncover a new definition of learning as conceptualized, narrated, and imagined by the guest on our show. Today's guest, Dr. Traci Scheepstra, is a dear mentor and a close friend. She was actually an instructor at the Bachelor of Education program, and that's where I met her. I was in one of her classes over there at Western University. And just a small little bit of information for the listeners before we get into Tracy's introduction. And I remember telling this to Tracy as well. When I was in her class, I think towards the end of the semester, I actually told her that if there was one instructor I'd really like to model my future classrooms on, it would be yours, Tracy, because what I remember from your classroom is that you gave every student so much attention, and you always felt like they needed to be included. And, as a new teacher candidate, that was really, really nice to see. And that's something that sort of safety and that sort of space was what I wanted to give my students in the future. So thank you for doing that for me. And but just to give you a background of Tracy's professional and personal journey, Tracy is the CEO and founder of Embodied Learnings, which is an organization dedicated to creating thriving classrooms where students spend more time moving and less time sitting. I will be linking the organization website in the show notes below. And I highly recommend looking at all the resources in text and video form that Tracy and her partner, Rachel, have put up there. Um, Beyond embodied learnings, Tracy is a teacher, educator, and educational researcher. She has a PhD from the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education that she completed from 2009 to 2018. And I actually really enjoyed reading parts of your thesis that was titled Making Meaning of Gender Based Violence, Elite Subjectivity, and Gender Performance in a Canadian Private School. Before she started her PhD program, she also completed a Master of Arts in Dance from York University from 2007 to 2009, right, Tracy? And then before that, she also had a Bachelor of Arts with an honors in Fine Arts Studies and Dance as a minor, and Fine Arts Studies as a major, which goes way back in 1990 to 1994. And in the middle of this, Tracy also somehow managed to run a wonderful arts-based program in the Durham region for over 13 to 14 years, where she implemented arts-based programs for children in the age group of 0 to 12 years. Right, Tracy?
Yes.
Yes. And, it's just so many. I mean, Tracy has such a prolific career and she's done so many different things. So I just wanted to summarize everything she's done. But in addition to her professional life, Tracy is the wife to a wonderful partner, and she's the mother of two beautiful children, Rachel and Ethan, and also the grandmother to two more beautiful children that she loves dearly. And I feel that is such an important part of her identity. She's been an instructor at various universities, doing courses related to arts-based programs, dance pedagogy, and peace education. And hopefully we can delve into all these different areas in this short talk, which is not an easy thing to do. Um, but Tracy, first of all, thank you for your work and thank you for making time for this discussion. Yeah, I just wanted to. I'm very grateful for this opportunity, and
Well,
you
thank
know,
you for having me. I was going to say that was a beautiful introduction. I was listening to that and I was like, wow, you did your research. And it's just actually lovely to hear. We don't often think back in those terms. So to hear you sharing parts of my life as you did, it was actually really heartwarming to just kind of be reminded of some of the places I've been. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think one of the defining sort of aspects of your career over time, Tracy, is just how brave you've been with your professional decisions. Whether it's, right out of university, you had the choice to take up a teacher like a teacher education program, but you knew that was not for you, and you went the arts-based education way. And there were so many different points in your life, and I want to really backtrack a lot more to a point um, when you were a student at school, Tracy. And we often think about um, so many other professional experiences in our life, and you do really identify as an educator and teacher.
Mm.
But I'm curious about what you were like as a student at school, Tracy. What were the things you were interested in? Going through your blog, I know that you grew up in British Columbia. Is that
Mhm.
is that right? And
Yeah, and in Alberta as well before that.
oh, okay. And so I'm just curious, what was Tracy like in that period from way back in grade 1 to grade 12, if you have any recollections of that phase of your life?
Uh, I have tons of recollections. That's one thing I have is a very profound memory for my childhood. As far as being a student, I never thought I was the greatest student. I never felt actually that I was educated in the way that really met my needs as a student. I was someone who, I was certainly interested in what we were learning, but I think if I'd been taught differently, it would have had more meaning for me. I loved being more physical. Again, in those days, I loved to move. I was very athletic and I loved dancing. And so when I was able to really utilize that part of myself, that's where I really came to life.
Mm.
And I also I've always been very creative. I had a great imagination and I loved storytelling. And so that was something that from a very young age was really sort of prevalent in my world, was being able to tell stories. And I actually often pretended that I was somebody I wasn't. So I remember going for walks with my dog to the beach and I had a whole different nationality and name and hair color and everything you can imagine. And I would go and be immersed in this very creative make believe world. And I had young sisters, and I would often tell them stories that would last days or weeks. And I would take them on my paper route and just share all of these things. But I also loved to pretend that I was a teacher.
Mm.
And being the eldest of two sisters, it was really great to be able to tell them what they had to do. And so I would get them to, read certain books and I'd have certain lessons. And that was where sort of I really knew that that was definitely a calling of mine, was that I wanted to really somehow educate. But as when I was a teenager, if anybody asked, what is it that you want to do with your life? I would say, I want to dance
Mhm.
and I want to bring dance and creativity to others in my world. And I remember the way I would articulate it, people didn't always seem to understand how that could be possible. And yet I carved out an entire career where movement and the body is very intricate in everything that I've ever done. Not so much the way I imagined it when I was 15 or 16, but it was certainly something that has been the common thread through all the decisions that I've ever made and continue to feel is really important to this day.
Oh, that's yeah. And you put that so beautifully, Tracy. I'm just wondering because it's so hard for a teenager to have that sort of clarity so early on in their life, and I
Mhm.
feel like your passion for the arts was also in a lot of ways fed by the environment around you. And I'm curious about the influence of your parents, and your friends and your sister, and also um, the learning environment at your school in terms of were there any pivotal early learning experiences? Was there a dance teacher or a fine arts teacher or somebody that really got you thinking in that direction, or an adult that really pushed you in that direction at that point? Because I feel like those sort of early interactions can really set you up in the long run. I'm just curious about that for you.
For sure. When I was young, I remember I was in gymnastics, which I enjoyed, and I always loved dancing and moving to music. But it wasn't until I was 10 that I was put in formal dance lessons. And that it wasn't so much the teacher or even the environment per se, but how it made me feel. And I remembered that when I realized not only was I good at it, but it felt really good while I was doing it. There was something that happened when I was in the experience of movement where I felt free in a way that I didn't feel in many other ways, aspects of my life.
Yeah.
And so that was really profound for me. It was actually a way in which I could move out of whatever I might have been experiencing in my life or in my home life, and just be in a whole different space. So it was very therapeutic in many ways for me. And then in high school, I was really fortunate. We actually had a great arts program in my elementary school. Those were the days where arts were considered important, and we, were allowed to have dance clubs. And we actually did have, certain dance events and lots of music. And I played the violin actually for many, many years as well. And we had school plays. So I think that was good. That really did serve sort of that creative sort of need for me. But our high school, we had a phenomenal arts program, and they introduced a dance program when I was in grade 9. And they brought in phenomenal teachers from the community to run the program. And that was when my real love for dance and the arts. So I continued playing, in the orchestra. But then I started to learn dance in ways that I'd never been exposed to before. And so that was where things really, really shifted and came to life for me. So, and I had to choose, like my parents, I wanted to do everything. So my parents said, you have to choose sports or you have to choose the arts. And it was a very hard choice, but I went with the arts. So.
Yeah, but it's amazing that your parents were so supportive, but just having that program at that point in your life could also have played a very influential role in shaping that thinking. But I really like your point about saying how the arts gave you a space, even dance for that matter, gave you a space to really be who you truly felt you were. And I completely relate with that, Tracy, because growing up, one of my avenues to really express myself honestly was sports. I really enjoyed playing sports, and we had a little neighborhood playground near my house. I grew up in the Middle East, so we used to just go there, and we were so creative with how we created games and organized things.
Mm.
And that was my defining memory of my childhood, was just going to that playground and playing for 2 or 3 hours and just exploring the neighborhood. And we had, sometimes there'd be like a little construction site, and a couple of us would think we were on a little quest around the construction site, building our own world. And we were also very respectful of rules and boundaries in that little space.
Mm.
But then there were also times when it would translate onto more negative tasks where there was stereotyping. And those were some things we were also learning from those play and game situations. And I know you've delved into that in your dissertation um,
Mm.
at the middle school level. But, moving on to like your life after high school, Tracy, you did decide to do a Bachelor of Arts. And you had a major in fine arts and a minor in dance studies.
Yes.
So I'm curious about that phase in your life and what that exposed you to, because it's very different to study something at a more introductory level in high school, but then to actually specialize at it in university means you're really committing to that particular path. So what
Mhm.
were those 4 years like for you, and what was Tracy like as a young student at
Mm.
university?
Right. Um, so I really loved my program. It's interesting. The fine arts studies program was very interdisciplinary. And so I was able to be in drama classes. I didn't actually do music. It's interesting. I kind of gave up the violin once I started university. I enjoyed playing and I didn't love practicing. And I realized it wasn't totally where my heart was. So I started to explore drama. I was part of the creative writing program as well, and was attempted to write poetry. That's not my strong suit, but I did a lot of short stories and was in that. And then I really decided that I wanted to be more involved in dance. And so I ended up doing my dance minor. And again, I think always that is where I found my sort of between that and the writing, those were the two places where I felt most at home. And by the time I got to third and fourth year, I was just all in. I mean, I was taking the coolest courses and really meeting amazing people. And I thought for sure I'd go and do my master's right away. And the timing just wasn't right. But I really, really loved it. And I was, one of those students that I would say I did not excel at the courses I didn't love, like the electives that you had to take, like psychology. But when it was something that I absolutely, loved and could just go on and on and on, I mean, didn't feel like work to me. And so being able to talk about dance and write about dance and be in the classroom moving my body in dance was really beautiful. And what was an interesting turning point is they introduced a dance education course. It was two courses. One was specifically for the formative early years, and then one course was for children who were in more like primary junior. And so I learned really the nuts and bolts of dance education, which was a lot harder than I anticipated. And interestingly, a lot of students took it thinking it would be an easy course, and it was actually very complicated to really understand how you would take dance and bring it into the classroom to support student learning and wellness. So it's about movement, but also in an education space where you're actually taking concepts and bringing them to life through the experience of movement. Really, really complicated when you're first getting immersed into it. And then I started doing practicums in local schools around York University in Toronto, and that was when I really knew, okay, this is where I want to start going. And that was in my fourth year. And so after that, because I had decided that I didn't want to be a generalist teacher at that time, and I really wanted to be focused on the arts, I decided that I was going to become an entrepreneur instead. And I was going to try my hand at running my own business. And I was able to work in a preschool, and I was their dance education specialist. And then quickly after that, I also worked for a company where I was a choreographer for an after school program. And then I started my own business where I ran a music and movement program for families and their children, which grew exponentially over the years. And we offered tons and tons of arts programs. And then I went into schools as a specialist. So really, I would say the fourth year of my university was really pivotal in really taking me on that trajectory where I always in my mind thought I'll go to teachers college. And I went, no, I think I got to try something different. And it was a big risk. I think everybody in my family was like, what do you mean you're not going to go to teachers college? Like, you always wanted to be a teacher. That's all you ever talked about. And I said, I have to do it differently. So I did.
Yeah, and I mean, I can't imagine how difficult that decision would have been for you, Traci, because I mean, there are so many factors you have to consider in terms of, your own financial stability and thinking about how that would translate into a career in the long run. And to be so young and to make that kind of decision at that point of time, I think that's really wonderful. That, but I'm sure, as you put yourself out there into the world, opportunities just open up. And as you said, that the Art Space Center really exponentially grew, and if you never took that chance, you never took that risk, you would never know if that was the path that you should have taken. And I think that's something that a lot of us, we sometimes take a back seat and don't give our hopes and ambitions that sort of opportunity to flourish. And sometimes just putting it out there in the universe can maybe open up opportunities for you that you never knew existed in previously.
For sure. Yeah. And I think I'll be really honest. I probably didn't think lots about my own personal stability. I think it just felt like the right decision. And I probably would think about it more now, but I think when I was young, I just was like, I don't know. It just felt like I just need to go in this direction and we'll figure it out and I can decide later.
Yeah.
And I also, at that time, I was also married just after I finished my bachelor's degree. So I also had the stability and support from my husband too, which, he said, listen, if this is what you want to go for, then why not? So I have to say, whereas some of the other people in my life may have been more cautious for me, he was always my cheerleader. And so when you have a very supportive partner who at any point says, yeah, you want to do it, go for it. Like me going back to school later and doing my PhD, like, we can't often do those things on our own if we don't feel that we have somebody who really sees that we can do it for ourselves. And so I have to give him a lot of credit as well for just allowing me to always have my wings ready so I could fly.
Yeah, and I'm curious, Tracy. Just it's just beautiful that you had somebody that could support you at that point of time. But I'm sure you did so much to make that sort of journey for yourself as well. But did you ever consider doing dance and fine arts professionally? I'm just curious. Why was uh, rather than like you obviously had the option of taking up dance professionally and doing that full time. Was that ever something you considered, or even fine arts, because that's what you specialized in? I'm sure you had peers in your program that moved on to taking it professionally or doing it. So was that something that you ever thought about early on?
Maybe here or there. I don't know if I ever had the confidence to do that. Like I certainly enjoyed performing, but I think the education piece was always way stronger
Okay.
than actually living my life as a performer. I mean, in many ways, we are a performer when we're teaching.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think I got those needs met because I had so much fun with my students.
Sure.
And I think that just felt more meaningful.
Sure.
And again, to be a performer, like actually go there, it requires lots of auditioning. And I just don't know if I had the thick enough skin to deal with those kinds of rejections
Yep.
at that stage of my life.
Yep.
But I do remember always feeling like education was really my path.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it brought together your big passions of
Mm.
working with children, storytelling, your passion for movement. I think education was that sort of space where all of it came together. And
Yeah.
now that you jumped into Catching Fireflies, was that what the name of the organization was?
It became Catching Fireflies. Funny
Okay.
enough, the first name was Magic Soup.
Oh wow, that's
And Magic Soup actually came from a dance exercise, I like a children's dance education exercise by this brilliant woman named Sue Stinson,
okay.
who has been a pioneer of dance education. And I loved one of her books. And the whole idea was that whatever you put into the soup, and this
Mhm.
is relevant to life, is sort of what you get out of it. So you would sit with children, we'd sit in a circle and say, "Oh, what should we put into our soup?" And so we'd put in all these things, and it could be like realistic things, like I'm putting in carrots and I'm putting in this, and I'd say, "What kind of soup is it?" And then you'd feel this little bubble, and you'd be like, "Oh my gosh, I think it's a jumping soup." And then we'd all get up and jump around, and then jump back and say, "We've got to make a new soup." And so it was really this fun thing of we're putting this whole new concoction together, and every time we do it creates this whole new movement in our body. And so
Yeah.
I named my business after that because it was like every spoonful is a spoonful of creativity.
That's
And then it became Catching Fireflies later, which I had a partner for a short time, and so as we shifted into our partnership, we renamed it. But that was the name that I had for the longest. Yeah.
Well, that's such a nice, adorable story, because I'm just thinking about like that 12 to 13 year period. I think it's about 14 years, um, 14 years or more. You must have seen so many students and so many classrooms and so many teachers, and I think that's where your philosophy of the importance of the arts in education probably got really structured and developed. And I think so. I mean, if you had to maybe because I know a lot of teachers will also be listening to this podcast, Tracy, and because you had such like a close insight into that sort of process of what the arts can do for students at that age, because you primarily worked with students in the ages of 0 to 12, I mean about 1 to 12 years old. So I'm just curious about, like, what were some of the arts-based programs that you offered there, and what kind of impact did you see in the lives of students and teachers in that phase of your
Right.
life?
So within my own creative arts center, so I actually started where I was operating out of a preschool, and then eventually had my own space. And I saw we had families that came year after year after year. So there were many families that I actually got to know who brought their children into our studio space. And we had the music, early childhood music program. It's actually an international program called Kinder Music. So that was the program we taught. Plus we had visual arts classes. We had, summer camps. We had birthday parties that were all creative arts based. And then I would also go out into the community and do workshops in elementary schools, preschools, early years, the Ontario Early Years Centers, and sort of wherever people would ask us, and worked with a number of different age groups and teachers in sort of across the GTA or Toronto and the Durham region. And I think what was really interesting, one, of course, to see the evolution through the years in terms of where the arts were valued. That really changed in these schools, where there were certain times where people were more interested in having somebody come in to support the arts, and other years where literacy or numeracy was much more important and less pull back on the arts. So in my own studio, I was really fortunate that the people who came, they really saw the value of that for their own children. And many, many, many of my families, they were teachers that were bringing their children to me because they felt that their children were not, really getting sort of the arts experience in other places. And they really wanted that for their children. And so they would see them year after year. What was really interesting, and again, we had an infant program. So I think my youngest student ever was like 5 weeks old. And it was just so that, this family could get out of the home and have a place where they could meet other families and just, be in a creative space that that child just kind of grew with, over the years with us. But, it was really about, one of the most beautiful things was the way it brought families together, that they would come to a place where they could just bond with music and through movement, where there was joy that was created. There was no expectation. I always said every child participates in their own way. And sometimes participation is just sitting and watching. Sometimes participation is where children need to move in their own way, even if it feels like they're not connected in the same way as what the other children are doing. That it's really about them getting a sense of themselves within this space and how it makes them feel, and just allowing that process to unfold. So those were things that I think parents became more aware of, the more that I would say, just allow yourself to be here and just to see what happens. Mm-hmm. And I think people kept coming back because they loved how it felt and how they really had these moments of connection outside their busy life. But within the different programs we did, we also really focused on the fact that, students were, thinking more critically about their life. They were, learning specific concepts through the arts. Mm-hmm. They were, problem solving. They were, making really beautiful connections beyond that moment to something else in their life that they would share with me when it connected to a lesson or a story we were telling, or something we were creating. So for me, the arts is really also about life, and it's the way in which we really understand relationships and community. It is very much how we understand ourselves, and it's how we start to develop these really critical skills like listening. Mm-hmm. Again, with music and movement, it's instructional, but it's also sound. And it's like, as I hear sound, is it faster? Is it slower? Is it higher? Is it low? And can I respond with my body? So there's so many things that are happening within our entire being that happen when we're immersed in the arts. I mean, when it's playful, it creates engagement, right? Mm-hmm. So then students really want to be part of that process, and the learning just happens, mm-hmm. right? You don't have to try so hard. So those are the things that, over the years, I think parents would often comment on how they would see the change in their child's development in all these little ways, and they would really attribute it to being within sort of a very creative, environment. But when I would go into the schools, that was tricky sometimes, because I would also want the teachers, I would say, listen, I do not want children to be forced to, participate in a way that you think they should participate. Like, I want them to find their own comfort level. Like, the older the student, I find that sometimes the more discomfort that they can feel being fully expressed in their bodies.
Mm.
And so we need to give them time to adjust, into, because when they're little, movement is very natural and
Mm.
children naturally want to be more in their bodies. And I think that as they get older and they're sitting in desks all the time, we kind of strip away that sense of a more embodied experience. And so if we always sort of have students more, in a more creative experiential way of learning, we don't do that. But typically I think, the experiences that I've seen within education, it becomes more sitting, less moving, and then we develop almost a little bit of a self-consciousness around, creativity and self-expression. So I really noticed that with older students. And so it's
Mm.
almost like they have to relearn that it's safe to play. So we start low risk and, build in that comfort. Anyway, so those are a lot of I hope that's answering your question, but those are a lot of things that, happened and that I was aware of over the years.
Yeah, yeah, and you've completely answered everything that I, was looking at in that question, Tracy. Because I think it's such a large chunk of your life. It's like 10 to 12 years.
Mhm.
It's not really easy to, bring it all together in like a couple of minutes, and that is definitely challenging. But you beautifully spoke about so many different reasons the arts is so powerful for
Mhm.
students at different points in their life. And I really like that point you made about activating the five senses
Mhm.
and our connection to those five senses. And we all are listening, we all are seeing, we all are, smelling different things, and we all are feeling and touching things. But you know even that point you made about how some of these senses are, put to rest as we go through middle and high school, and we often think it's just something that happens in our mind. All the learning that
Mhm.
is just something that happens in, and it's not just something you should do only in an arts classroom. I think what I've really got from instructors like you and other mentors is that the arts, uh, as an approach to learning, can be easily integrated in a math classroom, or in even a language classroom, in so many different ways. And we really need to not think about that as something we do in a separate silo, but as something that we can do on a day-to-day basis to really allow students to freely express themselves through
Mhm.
all these senses. And also, I like, one of the things I picked up from what you shared, Tracy, was that the arts is not just something an artist needs to do going ahead. I think as human beings, just because we're not a scientist or not an artist, it does not mean we don't or can't practice art and science. We can dance in our house, and that makes us a dancer. We can paint in our house, and that makes us a painter. And I feel like that is something that needs to be really spoken about more. Is that this is
Mhm.
something that, as human, it's a very human, uh, like, it's a very beautiful human activity to engage in, to dance together, to sing together, to paint together. And it's, in a lot of ways, it's how we as humans talk about our lives and leave our stories. If you think about the way we talk about our lives, it's often in the music and in the books and in the family experiences and get-togethers. And I think that's that foundational connection of the arts being such a human experience, not just something we do
Mhm.
because we want to earn a living out of it, or and I really, as a teacher myself, Tracy, that's something I want to push. I mean, sort of want to share with the students, because I know that they are their own individual beings and they will develop their own understanding of these concepts. But I try very hard to not let them, um, because I'm teaching elementary school now, and you have grade 5 students, and I try very hard to make sure that they don't think that they're a math person or they're a
Mhm.
language person or they're an arts person. That you can be any of these identities at any point in your life, you know
Right.
and it's okay to not be good at something. And because what I've noticed is, even with the arts, as students move into middle school or with any subject,
Mhm.
as a teacher, as a first year teacher, I've noticed is that they're very like, students are very afraid in the first few phases when they do a particular task of not doing it right. And then as a teacher, when I give them some feedback, they look at that process as them not doing that task well at all. So they should not be doing this, because there is this notion that only if I perform well to the tests will I be good in this task. But even the most prolific dancers or the most prolific mathematicians, when they started learning something, I'm pretty sure they weren't very good at it. And they failed a lot. And I, like, more recently, I've realized it's so important to, as a teacher, to have a conversation, even yourself, to reflect on this yourself, that when you are learning something, failing is actually the most beautiful part of the entire process, because that's when you sort of see different things. And
Right.
you don't really have to call it failure, you just have to call it another attempt at picking up something new in your life, or
Mhm.
picking up, I mean, and I feel like those are some of the things I'm slowly picking up. And this is just to share my understanding based on what I'm hearing from you, Tracy. And I really appreciate the work, and just the amount of time you've put into articulating your thinking about this. And I think it's amazing that we have an organization like Embodied Learnings, where we have all those resources right now. But I'm sure Embodied Learnings, the organization that we see today, a lot of it goes back to those 14 years, where you were in those classrooms. And you also did a Master's of Arts in Dance Education
I
um,
did.
at York University from 2007 to 2009. So, thank you for all those years of effort that lead up to Embodied Learnings right now. But, I know right after your Master's of Arts at York University, you decided to pursue a PhD program at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education.
Yeah.
And this was in 2009. And that's when your shift to academia sort of started. So I'm just curious about, the context and the life experiences that led to that transition from
Mhm.
the Arts-Based Center and your MA in education to the doctoral program in 2009. How did that come about, Tracy?
Um, so I found that when I started my creative arts center, it was quite a challenge to understand sort of how to run a business. And I did that really successfully. And I found that as my children were getting older, I was doing so much work that was not always related to teaching. And I was found that I was not with my family as much as I wanted. So that was one part of it. I also really felt that I was at a space where I wasn't being challenged as much as I wanted. And a lot of I was only going into schools where they had the funding, for example. There's only so many schools that can raise money to hire somebody. And all the families that came to my studio were those that were financially able to, put their children in extracurricular. And I felt that there was so much more that I could do. And selling my studio, I think, and going back to school was at that point where I was like, I want to make a greater impact. I'm not sure where I'm going, but there are so many other children who I think could really use what it is that I have to offer. It's just finding my way to reach those students on a different platform. And so while I didn't know, I just knew that I was sort of at the end of the road with where I was with my business. And so I decided to go back and do my master's and really focus on dance education. And I really was, at the time, character education was really new. So I thought it was really interesting to look at character education through a movement perspective, and how you could actually help students think about ideas of inclusion and respect. And and there was a few other focuses that I was looking at, but like, how could we do that through a more embodied experience is what I wanted. So I actually ended up doing that as research, and I went into a school and worked with grade 2 students, and um, just to sort of see, like, could they understand these concepts differently through these movement experiences. And it was really interesting to see how, students that normally had not been included in the classroom, that when we did certain movement activities, were suddenly with a new partner or a group of students that did include them. So it was just sort of the starting point of where can I go and look at this differently. I'm watching my children in schools and just really seeing sort of relational dynamics. I also, that became something that was really important. I really wanted to focus more on conflict resolution and the ways that we communicate. And um, so once I started to really go, okay, I think I'm going somewhere, I knew at that point getting a PhD in education within curriculum teaching and learning, which was my department, was really where I needed to go next. And again, when I got started, still not quite sure where I was going. And then I was really fortunate that there was an opening for teacher education.
Hmm.
And I had spent 2 years working with on a research team where I was sort of considered the primary education specialist on that team. And we were looking at conflict resolution and peace building initiatives within sort of the context of elementary schools, but specifically in the kindergarten through to grade 3, and looking at circle processes and just lots of communication tools and things. And so again, because it requires the body, and communication is so much the body. So that again just started to, right, like to make me think, okay, how can I bring these pieces together? And I was going to say there's probably two different directions. I got into teacher education, but then there was also my research, which are kind of two diverging areas.
Yep.
But when my daughter was in grade 8, she had an experience of sexual harassment that was actually very traumatic for her.
Hmm.
And that was really changed the trajectory of what it is that I wanted to do with my own personal research, which is why I ended up looking specifically at school-related gender-based violence. But again, it was always rooted in, how is it that we understand our own gender identity? So again, looking back at sort of the body and the connection to our own body, and sort of what embodiment looks like, and all of those pieces. So that's sort of how I got into my research. And that was really helpful to also go back to the dance, and how can we talk to um, you know students and teachers about how it is that they can support their students, again, in respect and creating more comfort and safe spaces, by using these different modalities like the arts, and then my deeper understanding of sort of, relational dynamics. And then at the same time, I got into teacher education, and that's where I realized that this is where I can make my impact. Instead of me teaching it in my studio or going school to school, if I'm working in teacher education, and every year I'm able to teach cohorts of teacher candidates and really share what I know and all the insights, then they can go off into their classrooms and hopefully, take even one thing that they've learned and start applying that with their students. So that's what led me on that path. And I was in teacher education up till now. It's been 10 years.
Yeah.
So
And
anyway,
no,
yeah.
I'm so glad you moved into teacher education, Tracy. I would never get the opportunity to meet you otherwise, but I I really appreciate the fact that I got that chance to interact with you so early on in my career, Tracy. And it's also your the research, your dissertation. I'm about 30 to 40 pages into the dissertation now, and I think it's so important that you looked at a topic that, because I know there was, when I was reading through the introduction, there were a lot of challenges with getting access to institutions that would allow you to conduct your research in the most honest possible way.
Mhm.
And that I feel is one of the, as practitioners, as school teachers, we're often trying to find a way to connect our work in the classroom to the research being published about education, and there is you need someone that has their shoe in both areas to be able to make that connection. And
Mhm.
I feel like because you were an educator for so long, and then you had that long training in academia,
Mhm.
I think your research really found a balance between academic research and what's happening in the classroom in a very beautiful, seamless way. And I
Mhm.
think it's so important for other teachers in the classroom to also realize that they are also researchers. The
Yeah.
things that they observe in their classroom
Mhm.
are things that need to be studied and analyzed, because when we document our understanding as teachers, we're
Mhm.
actually allowing other teachers to reflect on the same experience. Because as I read through your thesis, Tracy, I am constantly aware about what I am doing in my classroom when I
Right.
see such a situation that happens there.
Right.
And I think that that in the long run is the legacy that that kind of research can actually leave behind for teachers,
Mhm.
that actually want to go into the classroom. And I really think, like, I know we were introduced to it at a more foundational level as teacher candidates going into our B.Ed program, but accessing and reading academic research should be a skill most teachers should be really introduced to, and also given additional in-service training on, because there's so much that researchers like you do. You
Right.
spend such a large chunk of your life, 10 years of your life, really documenting,
Mhm.
that significant understanding. And I
Mhm.
feel that as a teacher, if I spend even half an hour or 45 minutes a week, reviewing latest research in the field in different disciplines in different areas, because it does get very specialized, even in like a small area like curriculum studies. There are research studies related to mathematics education, research studies related to language education, and then even smaller areas over there. But yeah, I just wanted to thank you. And I completely agree with your insight or your reflection about how being a teacher educator,
Mhm.
you were just able to reach so many other candidates, because in an indirect way, you will influence their life and they will go into their classrooms and sort of impact students in so many different ways. But what I will recommend to the listeners is to take some time to really review Tracy's research. I will include links to her research and the organization's website, because it's really hard to summarize and talk about it in a small discussion. But
It's a
Tracy,
long dissertation as well.
it is, yes. I think it was 402 pages or
It was, yeah,
a little.
it was a mammoth project to write about,
No,
but
but thank you, Tracy. I genuinely think that, that sort of effort that you put in that 9-year period, it will have a legacy
mm,
or a contribution way beyond what you think. And as a teacher myself, reading that, I already see the impact in my practice.
mm,
So I really appreciate that as a teacher. But I really wanted to end this discussion, Tracy, with, on a more personal note, because I know your identity as a partner, as a mother, and
mm,
as a grandmother are so important to your practice as
right.
well. And I think family has been like a foundational sort of motivation for you with your research, with
Mhm.
your work in life. So, and I remember having this conversation with one of my practicum supervisors, and I do not have kids myself, but I remember her telling me that when she became a mother, um, she realized that every kid in her class is someone's baby, and that in some way shifted her practice.
Mhm.
So I'm just curious about how did becoming a mother and now a grandmother, and also, being the wife to a beautiful, like such a supportive husband, how did those elements of your life shape your practice as an educator?
Um, so I totally agree that when I became a mother, it really, really changed my perspective. It was actually my son that probably shifted it the most. He's now 22, but
Mhm.
as a young child, he was what I would call a very spirited child, in that he had so much energy and he had a very, very strong personality. And he taught me so much about patience. An incredibly loving, compassionate child, and also just a force. And, my mother always jokes that if I had only had my daughter, I may have seen other children in the world who had that stronger nature about them, as maybe the parent had done something wrong. And I realized that here I had two completely different children and that needed really different approach
Mm,
as a mother. And being the mother to my daughter was actually very easy because she was really focused, and she would just sit and read books. And as she got older, she just loved to be in conversation, and she was always, even when she was really little, she just loved listening to the adults talk. And but my son, he just needed something more, and I really had to tap into, who is this person
mhm,
and how can I best be there for them? And it took me into places of great discomfort because, there were times where I just thought, okay, I've got to figure this out. I don't feel like I'm doing this right. And then I realized, okay, like I need to get on the floor and I need to really wrestle with him, or he needs longer transition times, or like it was these other things. And the moment that I started to really get comfortable with, again, parenting these two beautiful children in completely different ways, I could see my students so differently,
mm,
right? Because it's so easy to label and judge certain students if they are behaving in a way that doesn't make us feel comfortable, or we don't like, or we think it's disruptive, right? We praise the ones that seem to be doing the right thing and following along and listening quietly. And it's not that there's something better or worse about either of them. It's just that they have different needs, and we need to find a way to engage them. And that's really tricky, especially in a classroom. But it really took away for me that sense of, I am not here to judge them, I am here to love them with my students and get to know them. And it just transformed the way that I was able to look at the children in my care. And it was interesting too, because when I did my research, my son was incredibly helpful. So here, his sister had had this experience that was really traumatic for her and very difficult for our family. And again, I explain that in the first chapter of my dissertation really well. Like, it was one of the hardest things we've ever gone through as a family, to support our daughter and just to know kind of how to move through something, that was that impactful. But when I actually was doing my research, I was working with grade 7 and 8 students in a school, and I would see particular things happening with male students. And I would go back to my son, who was in grade 8 at the time, and I'd say, this is what I'm noticing in my research. What do you think about that?
mm,
And he would articulate, Mom, it's really hard to be my age, or it's really hard to be in school when somebody says that, and to stand up or whatever. And so he taught me so much, even about what I was seeing in my research, by listening to him talk about his own lived experiences,
mm,
that I could look at those children and say, just observe. And again, those are somebody's children, and they are trying to figure it out. And I am not going to villainize them any more than I wanted to villainize the children that, harmed my daughter. They were just kids. So those things have been really impactful. And I feel like I do that regardless. I am a person that I think really takes people and tries to get to know them. I've done that with my teacher candidates too. My biggest job has always been, the most important thing for me, always, as an educator, it always has been, it always will be, is that I need to develop a relationship, which means that I actually really see you and I hear you, and I want you to know that you matter to me. I am not going to ever be everybody's favorite teacher. I know that, because we don't match up necessarily with everybody, but my intention is always, always, always to be present to those that I am entrusted to be with in an educational space. And I do everything in my power to let them know that. And that is where I think has been my greatest learning through being a mother, and the relationships I've had through my family.
yeah, and you really demonstrated that even in your practice as a teacher educator, Traci. Because one of the things I remember from Teachers College being in your classroom was this activity where you made us all write you a letter right at the start, telling us how we were feeling,
Yes.
and that's actually something I tried to implement in my own classroom, where every month I let the students write me a letter, and I also write them a letter telling them, on a personal note, how I
Mhm.
feel about, or how they are feeling about what's happening in class.
Mhm.
And the other day I was just thinking that on a day-to-day basis, I try my very best to have a heart-to-heart conversation with each student in my class,
Mhm.
just to check in with them and say, and not about something at school. And I think that's where my practice has slowly shifted as well, where coming into teachers college, I always thought it's about how you deliver the curriculum,
Mhm.
because I was very naive. I didn't really understand. And and even as a younger teacher who's not really a parent, you think that getting the curriculum done, finishing all those objectives, that is the goal. But at the end of the day, if you don't have a strong relationship with your children, and I
Mhm.
think it's so much more challenging with teaching, because you get them for just 1 year,
Right.
and parents are able to see the kids growth from a very young age to where they are now.
Mhm.
So as a teacher, it's so important for you to really be empathetic, to not only understand that there is something that the student has experienced before they came into the classroom, and they
Mhm.
will experience things even after they go out of your classroom. So you need to be humble in the sense that you're not going to be able to completely transform their life, but if
Right.
you really listen to the kid's story, they will give you answers to what they need. And I like one of the I recently read a book by Alison Gopnik, who's this developmental psychologist, and the book was called The Gardener and the Carpenter.
Mhm.
And in the book, she mentions this analogy of how there are two sort of approaches to creating a nurturing environment for children. Is that one is, as a carpenter, we try to sculpt the perfect individual based on what we think the right model. So we tell our kids that you need to study this, you need to study that, this is the path you need to go to. And then the other approach is creating a garden where your student can just, live, and you are there. But
Mhm.
in that garden, they just have the opportunity to explore so many different things. And it's okay if they fall a couple of times, but
Mhm.
they can actually just grow, and you are there if they need any support. But I feel like that is the approach I think your work also moves towards, creating that nurturing garden. And and that's sort of the philosophy I'm trying to also evolve in my own practice as an educator. But Tracy, I want to be respectful of time. I think this conversation, I can just talk to you for hours and hours about all your work. But
Can
I
I just
mean,
can I just add one quick thing before you?
yes,
I was
please.
just going to say, as you were talking, I just kept thinking of planting seeds
Yes.
and what it means to tend to the garden
Mm,
without without over um, without overly manipulating and managing, right? Because what I love about the analogy of plants is that they just know how to be, right?
mm,
Plants don't need to be told how to bloom,
mhm,
how to grow, right? They just do. And while children need some guidance and nurturing, that the more that we come in and kind of try to micromanage what that is, they can't just be and bloom the way that they would naturally, choose to do if
mm.
we gave them that space. So plant the seeds and tend to it, and and make sure they get that water and all that nourishment through the education space. But then it's like, just allow the growth to also happen, and so that they can show you, what they look like in their full form.
Yeah, and that's a beautiful note to end this conversation. Tracy, thank you again for your time. And
um,
to the listeners, I will be linking all of Tracy's work, at least as much. I mean, there is so much to review, but I'd recommend going through the Embodied Learning's website, as a teacher or as an educator, but also as a parent or student just interested in how movement can really transform classrooms and learning environments. And I will also be linking Tracy's research, and I would also recommend looking at Body Talks, which is this wonderful initiative started by Embodied Learnings, where they interview a lot of professionals. And I've got a lot from these resources that Traci and her team have shared. And I think it's really important to take this discussion forward and not just stop it with listening to this podcast or this interview, but also maybe reaching out to Traci and her team at Embodied Learnings to see how you can work with her to really bring that into your classroom if you're an educator. But as parents, I'm sure there are ways they can also engage with you. So until next time, thank you again for listening to this. Stay tuned for more such episodes with other learners and who have other beautiful stories. Until next time, keep learning. Thank you again, Traci.
Thank you so much.